we will finish our last chapter, part of our last chapter today, but we will also go back a little bit, back up and talk a little bit more about bilingualism and education. This is the previous chapter. We did not go really far and deep into this topic, and I wanted to expand just a little bit because it's such a hugely important topic for anyone who studies sociolinguistics and is interested in education. Even if you're not going to be necessarily going to the classrooms to be teachers, it's still good to know about this. These are sociolinguistics issues that have to do with education and second language acquisition or bilingual language acquisition. So there are different kinds of programs for bilingual students. Of course, this is perceived in the school system as a problem, that there are students who come from different backgrounds, from diverse backgrounds, whether they speak different dialects or different languages, and that is perceived as something that requires a lot of funding and requires a lot of effort, and is something that would be perhaps preferred that we not focus on, but of course it's impossible not to look into this issue, and there have been different, and I'm not, I don't want to generalize but basically because our culture in this country is very much based on monolingualism being the norm. And if we think about the world as a whole, monolingualism is not the norm. People around the world are multilingual to varying degrees. So some people know a couple of languages, one language. Everybody tends to know the so-called quote-unquote mother tongue, native language, L1, neutrally referred to as L1. And then L2 is what is then acquired later on, and there can be multiple L2s, second languages, foreign languages, and so on. But people are multilingual to very, very varying degrees. Even if you know a few words of a language, then you could be called a bilingual. That's an extremely inclusive definition. Some very narrow definitions, as we have mentioned earlier, they according to those definitions, you have to be able to pass as a native speaker in 2 languages in order to be called a bilingual. But that happens rarely. I am proficient enough in English in order to be allowed to lecture in an English department, but I don't pass as a native speaker. People notice immediately that I come from somewhere else. So somewhere in between those two extremes, you can find people at various stages of competence in other languages. And that's extremely common. If you've studied one foreign language in school, you fit on that continuum somewhere. You are, to an extent, bilingual. And it's just that, we're basing a lot of our understanding of society on it being monolingual. It's not taken as that has been taken as granted that everybody speaks English or should speak English if they don't. But then the school system has to face the facts that this is not the case. We get children from these various different diverse backgrounds. So there have been so-called submersion programs. It's not really a program in a way. It's like, okay, these children, the aim of the submersion programs is that a child is submerged in the English language environment. And the aim is linguistic and cultural assimilation. That you leave behind your first language, your L1, and L1 culture and acquire English as your language and your the local culture as your culture. So the native language is either suppressed or ignored. When we talked about this, we talked about the methods of suppression, like for instance for Native American children, the schooling system, when you sent the students far away from home, far away from the reservation, to a fully English language setting, and deny them the opportunity of speaking their first language, even during recess. So, and it wasn't only the Native American children, it was immigrant children and so on, who were told you can't in school, you won't speak anything else than English. So that leads to what is called subtractive bilingualism, that a child, every child has the potential of being multilingual, but you have to somehow nurture the L1 in order to make this happen, because languages die so that the language speaking, understanding competence dies within a child. That if everybody just moves on and acquires English, then that leads to the death of the language in that particular individual. Not necessarily the death of the entire language. But in the case of Native American languages, the more students who were suppressed from speaking their native languages, the more people we had who couldn't speak them, and then when the last speaker dies of a language, then that language is gone. And we have cases of this from the history of the languages on the world map, that there have been languages that have died. Now it is possible to revive a language, and we took one case, the Hebrew case, as an example, and that was based on very strong language policy support, and also the mutual goals of the speaking community, or the community of those who knew Hebrew from the text, so that they could transfer the written competence in that language to become a spoken competence. But they still had to work an awful lot in order to make it into a usable spoken language. But so those cases sometimes exist, but it's much more common that languages die because speakers quit speaking the language. Okay, so that's the result of the subtractive bilingualism, is that you increase the knowledge of English, but subtract from the knowledge of the native language. Then immersion programs have a more noble goal from the point of view of a linguist, especially someone who really appreciates multilingualism. The aim of the immersion programs is the enrichment of language skills, and the desired outcome is additive bilingualism, so that we don't subtract from a child's first language, we add the L2 to the L1. So that's the goal, and these programs, they don't ignore the fact that the children come to school speaking another language. In Canada, they have had extremely successful immersion programs, in French and English immersion programs, because French and English are the official languages of Canada, and you've been reading about that in the language policy chapters, that it's not a frictionless coexistence of the two languages, because people tend to become kind of like okay, this is my language and it needs to have the same rights as the other person's language, and then we get into situations of maybe having more rights to one language and fewer rights to the other one. But the goal of multilingualism, the goal of bilingualism has been, in the language policy, it has been expressed by the fact that Canada is an officially bilingual country, and then they also have the First Nation languages that are supported to an extent. So the immersion programs in Canada have been successful. So we have English L1 students learning French, being immersed in French, but at the same time their L1 skills, competence is being developed. And the other way around, that the French children are immersed in English-speaking situations. Now this in Canada has been said to be kind of like elite bilingualism, that a lot of English speaking children from English-speaking families, they are placed by their parents into these immersion programs, French immersion programs, so that they would become fluent in French. And it's been a little bit, people say it may be the results of the research done on the level of bilingualism with these children may have something to do with the fact that they tend to come from affluent, more affluent backgrounds, that middle class, upper middle class people are interested in their children's developing bilingualism. This is, by the way, this is in stark contrast with the history of the research on bilingualism, because if we go back like 70 years, 60 years, the research on bilingualism tended to say that bilingualism is bad for children, because they were studying bilingual children who came, from immigrant backgrounds, many of them from poor backgrounds, and it was not this elite bilingualism. It was instrumental bilingualism, that you have to get by in order to be able to do certain things in this country, and people say that, oh, these children are not doing well. They were not doing well because most of them were in these submersion programs. Or it's not really a program, but it's an approach to bilingualism. That, of course, if you do not support the child's first language, they cannot develop in their first language, and then there tends to be that they are falling behind in those areas where they would need to be understanding more of what's going on in the classroom, right? So the research was like, bilingualism is bad, and then it went to the other side after these Canadian immersion studies, that, oh, bilingualism is good. And today the consensus among researchers tends to be that, yes, bilingualism is good. It has a lot of good things to offer, because when a child has to be constantly dissecting, analyzing not only one but two language systems that may sometimes be radically different from each other, that develops the cognitive analytic skills that are transferable skills, so that bilingual children tend to do better in other school subjects like math and sciences and creative areas, also because your brain is used to, with every sentence a child who is bilingual hears, they have to figure out, okay, which language was it? How do I analyze this? And it's of course in split seconds, but they learn those two very different systems that develop their cognitive skills. So that's kind of like the consensus nowadays, that bilingualism per se is not good or bilingualism. Of course, I mean, it's good if you can get by in 2 different languages. It's kind of like an asset. But beyond being just an asset, it can develop skills, cognitive skills that are used in other areas of life and in school life. But also at the end of the life, people have been studied who are bilingual, that it may be something that if you are constantly, your brain is constantly working on 2 different systems, that may keep up the brain a little bit longer from becoming, like for instance, not getting Alzheimer's or other forms of dementia. So they have some people have gone so far that in order to exercise your brain, you can at an older age, you can start learning another language because you're using the brain in multiple different ways, because language competence is not just that you understand, it's understanding production, analysis of grammar, and even writing in a foreign language, but that tends to be kind of later. But in any case, so it's kind of like proposed as some kind of a postponing trick that you won't get, necessarily. Of course, we don't know, but it seems to be helping. It may also have to do something again, with social class, because learning foreign languages tends to be a middle class hobby more than a working class thing, even though it shouldn't be, of course. So anyway, here's another program, Transitional Bilingualism. The aim of the Transitional Bilingualism approach, it's not really, not really a program either, but the aim is, again, in the same way as in the submersion approach, the aim is assimilation, that you forget the L1, language and culture, and you move on to be fully assimilated into L2, your L2, the majority language in the case of the USA. But there is instruction in the native language, but that instruction is only as an aid to allow the children to proceed into ordinary mainstream classes in the majority language, because it kind of makes sense that I mentioned it briefly at the end of when we discussed the bilingualism and education, multilingualism and education. I mentioned briefly that, of course, when you come to the 1st grade, you the cognitive skills that are required at school, kindergarten, preschool, 1st grade, 2nd grade even, the cognitive skills are not that developed that you can be picking up the language, the L2, at the same time as you're picking up the content of the school. And then but if an immigrant child comes to school in junior high, especially senior high, the cognitive level of the content is already so high that if you don't know any of the L2, if you don't know English and you put in biology classes completely in English, then you're kind of like bound to fall behind from the native speakers. Because no matter how smart you are, if you don't understand what is being explained in school, if you don't understand the assignments, then how can you do well? And it's based on these kinds of situations that that these studies, they were focusing on kids who did not do well, who came from immigrant backgrounds, and then the conclusion was bilingualism is bad. because the children are not doing well. Of course, they are not doing well because nobody's helping them out. And especially if they come from families where, as I mentioned a couple of times last time we talked about this, but it's an important point to think about, that if the child comes from a family where mother and father work from dawn to dusk to support the family, or if they come from single parent backgrounds or whatever, where the parent does not have either the skills or the time, then there's nobody to help the child, and they're kind of like thrown into that. And you know, again, I'm pulling an example from my own kids. My daughters did not need. They were younger when we immigrated to California, and they went to school without knowing any English. They knew a couple of words, maybe like cat and dog and butterfly, but they went there and didn't know any English. But by Christmas, they had acquired English, and they came home and they were actually speaking English to each other, not Finnish anymore. So, but I did not need to help them in their school tasks because the tasks were so low cognitive level in the first and second grade. However, my son, who was 11 when we immigrated, so he was like upper elementary, starting junior high, I spent my evenings with him, just translating and explaining to him what he needs to do, because the prompts that kids get at that level, they are like, you know, there's a long verbal explanation. And for instance, even the math, he was into math. He ended up becoming an engineer, so he was really into math. But how can he do well in math if he doesn't understand the verbal prompt of the math problem? So I sat down with him. I translated. Now, he had a mother who had, I was in grad school, so I could arrange the time. I didn't have to work from dawn to dusk. And I was available to help him. I also knew English because I was a former English teacher. So his situation was, he did not fall behind because I was really working hard. I was like taking his classes with him basically. But who has time for that? How many people, how many mothers, how many fathers have time for that, even if they know English? He was in a better situation. And I'm telling this because somehow, like really concretely shows the difference of the age of entering this country, entering the school system by a child who does not know English. So the transitional bilingualism approach is meant to take care of the fact that initially the kid doesn't know English, so let's teach the child initially English, and then after the child has acquired enough English, learned enough English, then kind of mainstream the child. But there is not anything done for the child's first language, and I'm not expecting the American school system to have done anything for my child's Finnish. That was the parents' responsibility. But the Spanish language immigrant children, surely we can do something to keep up their Spanish also, so that they can. That development in their L1 Spanish is not stunted because that's being replaced by a transition into English competence. So very often if you just teach a child enough, I mentioned my son graduating from ESL courses when he was on 8th grade. So he graduated, he transitioned, no more ESL, no more hand-holding to him in the school system. But anyway, so the result in these programs tends to be subtractive bilingualism or disruptive bilingualism, so that the children's skills, if you have friends who grew up speaking Spanish, for instance, first, and then they went to school, Spanish was kind of, they transitioned completely into English, and a lot of them may have very low-level skills in their L1. Now, this is like, okay, you hear these. We are in America. English is the language, so we are in America. Speak English. So that approach does not take into consideration the results, the consequences of losing your first language, because you lose something of yourself. And most concretely, what these children lose is they lose the ability, for instance, to communicate with their grandparents and their relatives, because if the grandparents are monolingual speakers of Spanish, you can't communicate with them if you can't speak in Spanish, or you can hug them, you can do things with them, but still it's limited communication if you cannot communicate with the grandparents. Most concretely, that's kind of sad. So sometimes people, there were these studies on immigration happens all over the world, and migration happens. So emigration, immigration, migration with one word, and they had a lot of studies on the bilingualism of Finnish children whose parents had emigrated from Finland to Sweden. There are about 1 million Finnish people of Finnish descent in Sweden. Now, Sweden and Finnish are totally different languages. Swedish is related to English, Finnish is not. And so there's nothing that helps there, even though these are adjacent countries in Northern Europe. But anyway, a lot of these families moved in the 1960s, left Finland because there was a lot of unemployment. It was post-World War. Finland had been in the war. It was a much poorer country than Sweden. So a lot of people left Finland in order to go and work in Sweden. What we stereotypically say, they went to work on the Volvo car factories, and a lot of them did. And their children went to school. And so this is in the 1960s. All this stuff has not really been fleshed out. Now Sweden is probably in the head of promoting multilingualism. But they were doing these studies that these Finnish children from Finnish backgrounds in Swedish schools, they were not doing well, and people said, they don't know either language well, so they're kind of like semi-lingual. They don't know Finnish, they don't know Swedish. That I don't like that term, but it is a possibility that if you're not supported in the development of either language, then you kind of like restricted to few registers. We have been talking. Everybody is competent in the variety of language they use, but we're sometimes limited to certain registers. That if our world is not open to a lot of situations, then our world is not open to multiple registers, which require different levels of formality or different lexicons and so on. So that was the term used of a lot of these immigrant children to Sweden, and the situation is quite transferable to other places where there are children who come from monolingual speaking backgrounds in a country that is foreign to them, and then they are thrown to school. What are they going to do? Nobody is helping them to develop in their first language. There weren't, in the early days, there weren't really efficient programs to help them with the second language. These things have been changed, luckily, because people have been talking about this. So then there's language shelter, and I apologize for, oh, I don't apologize. There's nothing to apologize for giving examples from Finland, but this is actually from books that talk about bilingualism, because Finland is also a bilingual country, Swedish-Finnish bilingual. There's a Swedish-speaking minority which is which has a history of being a more affluent on an average. It's no longer probably true, but like 100, 200 years ago, the people, Swedish-speaking people, they tended to be the leaders of the society, and they were more affluent than the Finnish-speaking people who affectionately can be referred to as the peasants at that time, before Finnish language was, by language policy measures, brought to be the majority language, the official majority language. So, so language shelter is a situation where children are taught through the medium of their L1, with the goal of maintenance and development of the L1 language and culture in interaction with the majority language and culture. So, so this does not really differ from the Transitional Bilingualism program, except for its philosophy that the goal is the maintenance and development of also their L1. So here, translated into the situation here in the U.S., that we'd be in school, the goal would be also so that the children would be taught in their L1 with the goal of maintenance and development of Spanish, for instance, in this country. So then at the same time, you would have like foreign language classes of English, and everybody is exposed to English. So English is not there for young children. It's one thing for adult immigrants having trouble learning English, but it's typically not a problem for children, right? So children are very, language, it's because of how the brain develops, and there is this so-called critical period that if you are exposed to a language before a certain time, you will acquire it to a much higher competence level in pronunciation, for instance, and so on, than if you wait 10 years. I mean, this whole thing that we start teaching. When did you start learning another language in high school? What grade was it?
High school.
In high school, yeah, not in elementary school. Kind of. You already started in elementary school.
So I took Spanish 1 in 8th grade because
Okay.
they offered it, and then I didn't like my teacher, so I switched to French in high school, and
Yes.
I didn't learn anything, but it was fun.
Yeah, right. Yes.
Had really bad teachers.
Yeah, and yes, it's also because it's not really a priority in this country. I hate to say this, but it's not. You don't have to. You're lucky in the sense that you don't have to spend hours and hours and hours learning foreign languages, because nobody understands English in the world. English is the leading language in the world. It's the lingua franca of the academic publication. It's the lingua franca in world politics. Everybody wants to learn English, so there's very little motivation. Motivation is a big driving force. Yes.
Why is that? Why is English
The leading language? It's because of the power. It's if we go back and think about the like British English, how during imperial times, colonial times, they went all over and at the same time kind of like imposed English for all the places they went to. So in today's world, in Africa, in India, English is the language that people use for, it's the language of education, it's the language of, that shows that you have education. So that was the British times. Then, of course, these places, they became independent countries mostly, but then simultaneously the United States has been gaining in power, in cultural power. If you think of Hollywood, everybody watches American movies, entertainment industry, everybody wants to listen to Britney Spears and whoever is, I'm probably behind in what the big names nowadays are, but like Elvis Presley in the 1950s, and they travel, they force their language everywhere, and now it's like, the new people, whoever they are. And the Hollywood movies, they're watched all over the world, and not only that, so entertainment industry, but also the military power. So English is enhanced, and American English specifically, because of the power that America has in the world. So, yeah, it boils down to power in the macro level of languages, and then we have looked at small exchanges between people who know each other. Even there, it comes to who speaks in what way. It has to do with the power, situation-defined power on a micro level, and then on the global level, the appreciation of language. Well, Russian was during the Cold War times, when the Soviet Union was at the peak of its military power. They were the first ones to send their Sputniks to the space. The space conquering contest between Russia and the U.S. And the Russians were the first ones. Of course, America was the first one to send the man to the moon. But these are exhibitions of power, right? But Russian was very influential. Also, so in Russia they have a similar kind of situation, that Russians don't typically speak a lot of other languages because they don't have to. People wanted to learn Russian in order to get ahead even though it's, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the context with the next chapter. But anyway, so this language shelter thing, just to finish this up, they acknowledge that knowing your first language is a good thing, because then you can add up the L1 and you're still young enough in order to learn it well, even without an accent, if accents matter. But if you are young enough in like elementary school, junior high, yeah. So the Swedish children, even those Swedish speakers form only like 5% minority in Finland, they are taught in their first language, and then little by little they add and develop also. So they grow up developing their L1 Swedish skills, and then on the side they also acquire and develop the L2, which is Finnish skills. So the aim is balanced bilingualism and L1 maintenance, so that you don't lose your first language. It's L1 maintenance is hard work. I have gone through that, trying to maintain the L1 of my children. Okay, so do you have any comments about this? they're difficult things, but it's kind of like the underlying philosophies, they guide the language policies then. So Lau versus Nichols, this is an old case today from 1970, but it's an important case from the point of view of bilingualism, bilingual education in the United States. So this was a class action suit against the San Francisco Unified School District, and it was filed by Chinese public school students, of course, you know, with their attorneys and their parents, but basically the students were the ones who were the official filers. So the claim was that there are no special programs available to meet their linguistic needs. And this case was initially, it was lost in the federal district court, but the Supreme Court overturned this decision in '74, and the Supreme Court gave a statement that the school system actually is denying the students a meaningful opportunity to participate in the educational program, because they were not, like in content classes, they were staying behind because they did not understand the content. And the Supreme Court also said that this case has all earmarks of discrimination, which is banned by the regulations. So that was a huge win for children from other language backgrounds, and it was not necessarily of how things change to be better. This still is something of a struggle, but language rights were recognized as a civil right, that you cannot, you know, discriminate against someone's language. So today the situation is such that there is still a portion of the population for whom bilingual education is intended for. Only a portion receives it. There's a lot of, students are still like falling between the cracks. Most schools do not attempt to maintain the native language. I mean, we're teaching English. We are teaching sometimes English in these transitional we're teaching children in content areas in these transitional programs, so they may be taking like sciences in their first language, but the goal is not to maintain their first language. And half of the schools, this may have changed since this source is written, but half of the schools do not, it gives an idea, a trend. Half of the schools do not provide any content area instruction in the native language. I don't know how that, works exactly. It would need another census probably, yes.
In my high school, they had a native speakers, English, I think, where the Spanish kids were taught English.
Okay.
Or kids who spoke Spanish but not very well, but also learned Spanish.
Yes.
I don't remember how it worked.
So there was an attempt, yes, and that's great, because sometimes it's like it's more important what the philosophy behind this is, because students they understand if we send them, if the teachers send them a message that we really appreciate your first language and you can learn in your first language, and at the same time we are also learning English, because this whole idea of a child's brain being limited to just one language is ludicrous, because we can be multilingual in many different languages, and very easily in two. There's always this input issue that if we don't have enough input in a language, then, because there's only 24 hours in a day that we can be exposed to a language, then we may not develop all those registers that we need. But anyway, Okay, so let's move on to kind of like, I was kind of like jumping back to the previous chapter and chapter 13, and let's continue from where we left the language policy chapter, chapter 14. So this is chapter 14, part 2 in Wardhaugh and Fuller. And this is something that, you know, we could have an entire semester on. What is the situation of different languages in different parts of the world? And I just, you know, pulled some of the topics that the book mentions, and also some that are kind of like, you know, good examples of the situation. So here we have just a part of Europe. A lot of the languages that we are familiar with. So we've got Spanish speakers. These are numbers of native speakers in millions. I was just listening because they have finished the census, and they're giving some the most recent census, the 2020 census. They're giving some examples of the numbers. Like there are 313 or something, don't quote me on this, million people in the USA, and over 300 million. And how the languages are distributed among those over 300 million is something that they typically also try to ask in the census, but they are estimates, guesstimates. Anyway, depending on how well the census questions have been asked and answered and recorded. But anyway, so if we look at Spain, Spanish speakers, 470 native speakers plus 100 L2 speakers. Portuguese, 220 plus, and these are in millions, yes. So Spanish is of course, because this is not only in Spain, it includes the speakers of Spanish in Central and South America and elsewhere in the world. But if we look at the Russian speakers, 170 million speakers of Russian, compared to, you know, it's compared now what we have English speakers, it's hugely more in English speakers. And of course this is something that you can just kind of glance and look at the areas that you're interested in. English, 400 million estimation. So I'm posting this, so we're just kind of like getting this idea of what are the small language groups, what are the larger language groups in the world. I'm gonna skip this now. It's a link that you can look at when you get the PowerPoint. Okay, so Russian has been. It's no longer like English. So it's never been like English, probably in the sense of world language, but during the peak of the power of the Soviet Union, it was a very, very significant language power-wise in the world. So we've got in this table, you've got, and this is based on 1989. So you've got the Russian speakers, 145 million. And then non-Russian speakers in the USSR, so this is the Soviet Union times. And your book has a good explanation of their language policies. Then the overt language policy was that children are able to keep their first languages. Of course, it was based, the whole Russian Empire was based on conquest, starting during the Tsarist times, and then the the Soviet Union times. So they ended up governing a lot of land where many different languages were spoken as native languages, and that's still the case. Many of these countries, they are independent now, so they are no longer under the Russian rule. But of course, the 70 years of the Soviet Union, and before that, a long time of the Russian Empire, has led to a situation where, especially the Soviet Union times, when there was this kind of like sneaky policy of sending people who are Russians, ethnic Russians, to other places in the Soviet Union where Russian was not the native language. So they sent a lot of these population movements, sometimes forced but encouraged also. So you move a population of Russian speakers, like for instance to Lithuania or Estonia, and then you end up with a situation where these people stay there, they have children, they have grandchildren who are Russian speakers, and you end up in a situation where many of these former Soviet Union states, which based on ethnicity initially, they are nowadays states where there's a significant Russian minority. So they end up in situations where they need to deal with, multilingualism, which is not bad, but it still needs resources and careful guidance. So languages, let's move to the US, closer to us. This is based on the most recent census data. Of course, they do census like 2010, and then this is lagging behind when the numbers were worked out. So languages spoken in US, showing languages with more than 1 million speakers. So people who are the proponents of this English-only movement, they are not really basing it on logic, because if you look at the magnitude of the speakers of English as native language, almost 80% of people. Of course, Spanish is growing, but at the same time, the people who speak Spanish, they most often do not speak only Spanish, so they also speak English. So that is 13%, and interestingly, the speakers of Spanish of that background form now a larger group than African Americans. So that happened not that long ago, that kind of a shift. So it's a bigger minority, very interestingly. Then you always have this other category, because these are two small groups to be listed separately. But then we have speakers of Chinese, Tagalog, Vietnamese, French, Korean, and German. These are these small slices there up. So that kind of gives an idea of the language situation here in the US. And also, what is very often ignored is the huge resource that people who speak a language, something else than English, as their first language, what kind of a resource that is. If we just think of trading and politics and even military, that you have people, the military has these very good efficient programs of teaching English, how to speak the language of the quote-unquote enemy, so that you can interrogate and spy and communicate maybe interrogate. Well, that happens too. So so we have to, it's easier to train a person who already comes from that background than to start from the scratch with somebody who has never heard, like for instance, well, I'm not going to say any, for instance, languages, but we can all think of, the political opposing languages to the USA globally. So let's move closer to Texas. And here we have this kind of a situation where English, of course, is the majority, but there is a large majority of Spanish speakers, and then also other languages. What are those? They include Texas German.
I swear I heard it over there, though.
It was over there.
Are they doing some work here?
I kind of want to go peek, but I feel like that would be weird.
Well, we're almost done, so we can go and see what it is. So look at these links. Here's Texas German. There are these areas where people actually still speak German. New Brownsville area, and this is German that is like these people have inherited it from their parents and their grandparents, sometimes from great-grandparents, and they still are competent to an extent because these have been kind of like isolated pockets. And of course, we have Native American languages here as well, and I've mentioned Alabama and Coasadi or Kashara before because it's close to us. The reservation is only 60 miles away from here. So there are all these links, and you can. I would like you to kind of like look at them. They are not long films or anything. Canada we mentioned already. French and English in Canada are both official languages, and then they also have the French, the First Nation languages. Now, Quebec is an area that is a stronghold of French, and then versus Ontario, which is a stronghold of English, and there has been friction between these two languages in Canada, but they are managing it pretty well. Your book gives examples from around the world, and as I said, we could talk about this for an entire semester. In India, they list 21 official languages, but that is only a fraction of languages that are spoken in India because it's like hundreds of languages that are actually spoken there. Among these official languages is the sacred language Sanskrit, Hindi, which is used as a sort of like lingua franca in India, and English also after the long rule by the British Empire. English was introduced there, but it was adopted as the language of education and a language of global communications. It opened a lot of doors with that. They have a so-called 3-language formula in schools that people learn Hindi and English, or they learn. It's explained really well in your book. So English is one of these languages. But also the local language is taught. So children learn all three. In Africa, similarly multilingual place. An example is pulled from Kenya, where the President Kenyatta, he established as part of his language policy Swahili as an official language, in addition to English, in addition to local languages. His own language was Kikuyu, a local language and yet he did not want to make that as the official language because because if you choose a one speech community's first language as the official language, there's a huge bias then. So he was like far-sighted, and people were like, but how can we use Swahili as an official language, because people don't even know Swahili and they have to learn it, or if they know it, they don't know it, very well, and so on. But no, it has worked out pretty well, to the extent that also in Tanzania Swahili has become an official language. But English is the language of kind of like, okay, I'll show that I have education because I know English, I use English, and there are some interesting code switching studies from Africa because people they draw from different languages. Africa is an extremely rich place in terms of linguistic variation. There are hundreds again of these local languages. Papua New Guinea was mentioned as another place. We talked about Tok Pisin earlier. That is an official language in Papua New Guinea, but there's another pidgin-based language which is Hirimotu. These are Creoles now. They have native speakers, and then also English is spoken there. Singapore is pulled out as another example where there are 4 official languages: English, Malay, Chinese, the Mandarin variety of Chinese, and Tamil, and so people can juggle with multiple languages. Of course, this means that you kind of have to learn these different languages because these are not strictly diglossic societies. You cannot predict where a certain language is going to be spoken, and that's the end of it.